Okay, good morning. My name is Gary Matsuoka, and we're here at Laguna Hills Nursery in Santa Ana. It's a Saturday morning, and it's getting close to fall. We're at the end of summer. So we have a particular class that we do quite often, at probably about once a season, that's talking about what is good soil. And the main thing we can tell you that it's not what's being sold at most garden centers. So if you go to any, especially a big garden center, you'll see pallets and pallets and pallets and pallets and rows of bag goods from different companies. And pretty much the main ingredient in all those, or the only ingredient, is ground up trees. So either bark or wood mixed with a little bit of manure or a little bit of some kind of nutrition is what they're selling, both as a soil amendment and as a soil for containers and as a soil for garden beds. They'll say this is perfect garden bed soil, and it's pretty much all similar. It's mostly, well, it's similar to this product here. So the primary ingredient in it tends to be ground up trees, and I can see what looks like some bark in there and some wood shavings in here, and that's the ingredients on the bag do say that it is. Now I'm testing my eyes. Processed forest products. So that's stuff from a sawmill that is not suitable for lumber, for selling as lumber, or the bark off the sides of the trees. So it's mostly processed forest products, and then it's got some peat moss, some core from coconuts, and or compost. And then it has a little bit of perlite. The white stuff in there is actually pretty good material. And then it has well, they have different ingredients in California, but still processed forest products, peat moss, perlite, and then fertilizer. So this is the soil they're promoting. Most soils are very similar. Whereas if you were to take a class in agriculture, they'll tell you that this is perfect soil. And they don't look alike at all. So this is from a friend's farm in Irvine. He tells me this is the best farmland he's ever leased. And that's about 80% sand. And that's what he considers the best farm soil compared to what they're selling us for pots, for raised beds, for things like that, which is mostly wood. So, they don't look at all the same, and they don't act the same either. So that's the problem, and we have to put up with this. Now, this has been promoted since the 1980s. So in the 1980s, it's a huge organic movement. They told the farmers, you got to have organic matter to grow crops. And so we think it went too far. So back in the 50s and 60s, this was a soil that my dad planted plants in containers.
Thank you.
I remember it because my brothers and I played in a big pile of it. So we know the texture. We made forts and roads and things like that. It was just a white soil. Yes?
What does the loam wheat mean?
We'll talk about that.
Okay.
So that's the soil I was used to. But nowadays, for the most part, this current generation of growers has been told to use organic matter as soil for containers. So if you see what's in this pot, it looks like, and it is, sawdust. Now, I know this grower, and I know what they use. So it's 75% composted redwood and 25% sand. And to us, that could work. So we do buy plants from them. Their plants will never look as good as things we grow in our own soil, but it can work. It can work. So, but it, again, it's nothing like real dirt. And the problem with this is it doesn't stay looking like this very long. So once you get it wet and you leave it in a pot for a while, then it starts decomposing. It doesn't stop decomposing. So it decomposes as long as there's a little bit of oxygen around, and a lot of them start turning real slimy brown because it's turning into sludge. Now, this plant can handle it. So among well, we'll talk about that first. So on plants, the requirements for a plant, now we'll draw a tree. Now, some of you in here are my age, and we were taught in elementary school that the roots of a plant were a mirror image of the top of the plant, which turns out to be totally wrong because roots have to breathe oxygen, so they tend to be less than a foot below the surface of the soil. So one, roots need oxygen. Of course, I'll make that number 2. Number 1, roots need moisture. But number 2, they need, so roots, so the top of a plant, the green parts of the plant make oxygen, but on plants, there's no way to get the oxygen from the leaves to the roots. They don't have the same type of circulatory system we do with, red blood cells that transmits the oxygen from our lungs all the way to other parts of the body. So the oxygen just goes out into the air, goes through the dirt as deep as it can, so the roots are living close to the surface where they can actually breathe. Number 3, I would put insulation. So roots don't like to be too hot or too cold. So generally they don't like to freeze, and in the contiguous 48 states, the soil does not freeze in most areas. In the winter, it stays above freezing. And also in underground, in normal conditions, it doesn't get above 90. So the roots need that insulation. The top of the tree can go way, like this cherry tree can go negative 50 degrees, and it can go plus 120. It doesn't seem to bother it that much, but the roots are much more sensitive to heat, cold, and being dry, and not having any air. Of course, the top makes air. So that's the needs of a plant. Now, of course, a lot of plants can get by on different amounts of water. So succulents can get by with real dry conditions. All plants like it wet. Don't let other nurseries tell you that some plants actually like it dry. It's like, okay, and among plants, there are various needs for oxygen. So some plants, the roots need more oxygen than others. And on this table, I put the ones that are known to need less oxygen. daisies, grasses, these lilies. Those are known to need less oxygen. The ones that seem to be very, very sensitive to lack of oxygen, English lavender, gardenias, papayas. Most of the California natives are also here. So they like plenty of oxygen to their roots. The problem with this is compost and it's not finished yet. You know, finished compost is carbon dioxide and water. When it breaks down totally, there's nothing left. So this is still decomposing and it's still using up oxygen. So that's one of the problems we have, is that this is competing with your plant's roots for oxygen, and this can win out. Now, the weirdest thing is that people think that this is actually natural. You know, they've convinced you that this wood and tree compost is natural. When trees die, they don't look like this. They don't turn into this. So a tree will sit there, you know, well, this is not a tree, total tree, but when a tree dies, the wood, the trunk, the bark, it can stand there for decades, if not centuries. Some dead trees stay there for centuries as they break down slowly. They don't turn into this. When they chop it up into little tiny pieces like this and you keep it moist, it can be totally decomposed in 8 months, less than a year. But intact trees, they don't decompose very fast. Termites come in, beetles come in, woodpeckers, everything is slowly changing them into something that wasn't the tree. But they don't suddenly, you know, if you chop up a tree and pile it up in a huge pile, it'll catch on fire. It's decomposing so fast. That often happens in areas where they're doing composting. The compost catches on fire. It's decomposing at such a higher rate that it heats up and burns. And there's nothing natural about that. So I would tell you that there's nothing natural about wood compost or bark compost. It doesn't exist in nature. And one of the reasons they make soil, quote, potting soil out of this is because they'll tell you this has no nutrition, and they claim this does. Now, plants don't eat plants. So it's really, really kind of strange. So in here, they do have I can see the fertilizer in it, because basically bark and wood is cellulose, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. There's very little other nutrition in wood or bark. A little bit, but very little. It's not much more nutritious than white dirt. Plus, that's not the role of soil. So in nature, the nutrition for the vast majority of plants is a layer of dead leaves on the surface of the ground. And in nature, well, they call it the duff layer. And I'll say this forever, I think duff is just short for dead stuff. But the duff layer on average in the world is 5 inches deep. But it can range, you know, if you're out in the desert, it's hardly there. If you're in a jungle somewhere, it can be feet deep. I'll still remember one of my friends went down to Guatemala. They wanted to see how deep the dead leaves were underneath some wild avocado trees. And he told me it was 5 feet deep. I was going, okay, 5 feet deep of leaves piled underneath these trees. But that's all the nutrition. It's on top of the ground. So that's a lot of organic matter on the surface, very little below. The only thing in the ground, the only thing that really usually gets there are dead roots. And the amount that most textbooks will tell you less than 1% of the volume of the soil below the surface is dead stuff. So the soil should look pretty much like that. This is off a farm. And what's interesting is University of California, Davis went around all the farms in the year 2000. They wanted to check to make sure the organic content of the farms wasn't dropping below what it should be, which is 0.9%. And they were very happy to report on their findings. They said it seems that all the farms are holding right at 1.1% organic content, and that's what that looks like. You just don't see anything. But here, a lot of people put in their raised beds pure this. And this is, I would say this is 90% organic or more. The white stuff in there being the only mineral product. And they expect the plants to grow in this. Now, what we know is that as this stuff starts turning to that shiny black slime, now these plants, again, the roots aren't sensitive to that, but most plants don't like that. And what you see typically is brown tip leaves. So this particular grower uses highly organic soil, and it's not the grower's fault. Back when I was a kid, all the growers did the same thing. We all used sandy white soil, and in the 60s, there was a lot of complaints because well, this is what we're told. Women couldn't lift the 5-gallon containers because with this in there, they were 40 pounds. So they wanted to make it more retail friendly. So they started adding things to it. Now, they asked universities what to do. And they said, well, peat moss is very light. So make it half peat moss and half this. Well, peat moss has always been pricey. So nurseries came back and asked them, well, can we use something else that's cheaper? And then they said, okay, maybe a third bark, a third peat moss, and a third sandy dirt. And that does work. It's not that heavy. But then they found out that the more bark they put in there, the lighter it got. So things went haywire. So this material, this company here looks like they might use this at pinches. I don't know if that's sand. It might just be perlite, sponge rock. But all the leaves get brown tips. And what we see with other plants, a lot of plants that are grown tolerate it, but they don't really like it. So like when we get passion fruit vines from other growers, this is what they look like. They look fine until we grow them, and they look like this in a soil without the freshly killed wood and bark. This is papaya from another grower, and when we grow the same plants, they look like that. This one, if you keep it really wet, it's going to rot. This one, if you keep it really wet, it doesn't rot. So water really doesn't have a whole lot to do with rotting. Most plants can be grown hydroponically in water, but the water's got to be clean. That's the key. If there's dead stuff sitting in the water has no oxygen, and that's the problem. If there's nothing decomposing in the water, it can stay totally wet. And I'll explain why that happens too. So, okay, let's see where we're going from here. So what is soil? Where does it come from? Yeah, there's a certain kind of rock. So the most common rock in the world at the moment would be granite. And what this is ground up granite. So on granite, and this isn't a great piece of granite, I don't know, it's one I found, but if you go into the mountains, the granite usually has a lot more white in it, and then it's got the black specks. Well, it turns out the white part of the granite is quartz. And sand, so soil, so the term loam is originally, technically means that this material is a mixture of the three main components of what we know for soil as sand, silt, and clay. And that all comes from this piece of granite. So the lighter parts of the granite become sand and silt, and the darker parts of the granite become clay. And generally, this is almost pure quartz. So glass is quartz, but granite is almost pure quartz. There's a little bit of other minerals that give it the colors that are associated with the clay particles in here. And that could be iron if it's kind of a reddish granite, brownish granite, or it can be other minerals that are associated with the quartz to make the clay parts. These are just about pure quartz. And if you do look at soil underneath the magnifying microscope, you'll notice that the sand is see-through. And the silt is see-through. The clay is darker, not see-through. So loam is just a mixture. So as this decomposes, it first breaks down into bigger chunks, decomposed granite. And then when the flows down to the riverbed, the river churns up all the pieces so they get smaller. Now this one would have made, so the brown in here is from the clay that, so when the decomposed granite washes into the river, the sand and the silt are heavier and usually deposited first, and the clay particles are much smaller. They usually flow further down the river. So our hills back here are sandy clay, but there are hills behind those that are decomposed granite. And as the water flows down the hills, the first stuff that comes out is the sandy loam because it's a little heavier, or it's rounder pieces, so they act heavy and they fall out of the stream bed first. So you got Anaheim, you've got Buena Park, you've got Garden Grove, very sandy soil. And then as the rivers went further to the ocean, they started depositing the clay. And so you have clay in parts of Costa Mesa, Fountain Valley, Los Alamitos. Those areas closer to the ocean have more clay in them because it settled out later. Even West Irvine is all clay. So sand, silt, and clay are what make up the soil. This soil here, when you analyze it, so a sandy loam. So loam just means it has significant parts of all these three. Sandy loam can't have more than about 30% clay. And this sample here is maybe 8% clay. And it's maybe 20% silt. So it's like 72% sand. And the way you can check that, you take this soil, put it in a mayonnaise jar about halfway up, you add water to the neck, a few drops of soap, shake it really good for several minutes. You got to get all the pieces down to their smallest particles that they have. And what happens is the sand, which is this much here, just drops to the bottom in a few seconds. It just drops because sand is heavy. Silt is a smaller particle like sand, but it's smaller, so it takes a while for it to settle down on top of the sand. And then the clay looks like grease in there, and it takes overnight to settle down on top of the silt. And on this sample here, it's less than 10% clay. And then you can see a silt layer, and then you see the sand, which is the majority of it. And that's considered great farmland. So you can do this with pretty much any kind of soil. If you get up in the hills here and you have your sandy clay hills, you'll see a thicker layer of clay, much thicker layer of clay, along with the sand and the silt. So rich loam has more clay. So we'll say here 30%, 30%, 40%. I mean, there's a lot of, the sandy loam can vary quite a bit too. So these numbers can vary quite a bit. Clay loam would be anything more than about 30%. So let's say 40% clay, 20% sand. That would leave 40% silt. Something like that would be a clay loam. And the problem with clay, well, okay, so there's two terms to know, well, more than two, but two main ones to know. The ability for a soil to hold water is called its porosity. And it's incorrectly used to mean that, everyone says clay pots are porous, they breathe. No, that's not what that means. Clay pots are porous, they absorb water. The permeability is the ability for air to get through the soil. Clay pots are also more permeable than plastic pots. So, but clay pots are real porous, but that doesn't mean that they can breathe. That just means they hold moisture. Now, how they do that, so sand particles are relatively large and relatively round. If you look at them through a microscope, they're fairly round. Silt is also fairly round, but a lot smaller, 1/10 the size diameter of sand. Clay is much smaller than that, and they're flakes. They're shaped like flakes. And the reason why soil can hold moisture is that they're all charged particles, and water is charged too. Water is ionic. So water molecule is an oxygen, two hydrogens, negative, positive. So it's a charged particle, so it sticks to any other particle that's charged. Soil is a negative charge. So water tends to stick to soil really strongly, at least one molecule thick, and then less strongly further out. But the clay particles are so small and they have much more surface area. So anytime a particle is half the diameter, there's more of those particles and the surface area doubles. So silt being 1/10 the size of that, there's much more surface area on silt than the same volume of sand, because this is only 1/10 as big as this. 10 times smaller has got to be way more surface area. And then clay, real tiny, way more surface area on clay. So clay can hold water better than sand can. Now, permeability is the size of the gaps between the particles. So if you have sand particles, you got these huge gaps between them. And if you study geometry, then you might know that because sand is fairly spherical, if you have, oops, Sorry about that. So if you have nothing but spheres, the spheres take up 2/3 of the volume, and the spaces between the spheres take up 1/3 of the volume. The size of the holes also help the airflow. So the smaller these holes get, the harder it is for air to get through it. So bigger things like gravel and sand, the air flows through very nicely. As they get smaller into silt, it flows at a slower rate. And clay hardly flows at all. It's flat flakes like confetti. So this is supposed to be kind of a representation of sand, silt, and clay. And in actuality, the sand should be volleyballs, much larger than the silt. So now the problem we have with clay is that the clay won't allow air to go through here too much. And we know the volume of the spaces between the sand and silt is 33% of the soil is air volume. So if your clay content exceeds 30%, all these gaps are closed. The clay fills them. So that's why clay soils, you don't need to be 100% clay. If you're 40% clay, all the gaps between the sand and silt are filled with clay particles. And the soil just doesn't breathe as well. Now, the comparisons on it. So we know that sand will hold, water will stick to it at about, ½ inch per foot. So if you have pure sand and you add water to it, that's 1 foot of sand will hold about ½ inch of water. If you have a foot of clay, it'll hold about 2.5 inches of water. Now there's different kinds of clay and different kinds of sand, but that's about normal. So sand holds about ½ inch of water per foot. Especially if it's coarse sand, clay holds 2.5 inches of water per foot. Of course, with plant roots, what we notice is if you've got clay soil, they can only breathe about 6 to 8 inches deep. If you have sandy soil, they can breathe 6 or 8 foot deep. So the roots go deeper in sandy soil than they do in clay soil. So it's kind of a wash. Clay holds more water per foot, but the roots can't reach it. Sand holds less water per foot, but the roots can go much further down into the sand. So it's not that different between having clay and having sand in your garden once the plants are well established. It doesn't seem to be that different. But that's real soil. Everyone keeps saying, well, add a lot of compost to soil till it's really loamy. That has nothing to do with loam. And they'll say that if you add a lot of organic matter soil, it'll become a rich black loam. That is not what you want. This is healthy soil. Black soil is, okay, so, well, there's one way to properly make black soil. So, National Geographic ran a good article about soils 25 years ago, and they mentioned that on a lot of volcanic slopes, like in Italy, they have really rich black soil, and it's due to a charcoal content. And the reason that happens whenever the volcanoes in Italy blow up, which apparently is fairly frequent, it's a carbon dioxide plume that comes out of the volcano, just spews down the slopes of the volcano. It's, thousands of degrees. The trees just turn to charcoal. They can't burn. They can't go to ash because there's no oxygen there. They're superheated and they go to charcoal. That's how you make charcoal. Super hot, heated wood, no oxygen. Or not enough oxygen to change it to ash. So they become charcoal. Charcoal is inert. Even though it's organic matter, it's inert. It doesn't do anything, but mineral nutrients that plants like, and a lot of things stick to charcoal really well. So the soils in Italy near the volcanoes are considered rich and black. And they said, National Geographic said, it's only 1 to 2.5% charcoal by volume, but that little amount of charcoal makes the soil look black. And it lasts apparently forever. They said you go down to the jungles of Mexico, and you'll see this area in the jungle that's totally lusher, way lusher than this area around it. It's like a big circle. They said you can dig down into that soil there and find a campsite that was a campfire 10,000 years ago. For the logs turned to charcoal in the campfire. And they said you can date it, and it's like 10,000 years old. And it's still making the vegetation right above it really lush. So that's rich black soil. It's in charcoal. You can make black soil by decomposing organic matter without enough oxygen, and that's sewer gases are black, and that's deadly to most plant roots. So we don't want dark soil unless it's charcoal. Yeah.
I just did a blueberry plant in compost, and after I took about an hour to get all the little fibers out, but after that I soaked it in water. The water was actually glass.
Well, a lot of these things that they use, barks and other things, have a lot of tannins in them, which are dark colored also. So, well, you get sewer gases that make the water black, and then you can also get tannins because this stuff is so fresh, it gives off colors.
Would that be more on the brown side a little bit?
It'd be more brown. If it's black, it may just well be sewer gases. So they say if you expose black soils that are because of sewer gases to oxygen and keep turning it, the color gets lighter and lighter and lighter as the sewer gases escape. So, yes.
I was in Iowa, and I noticed the soil was black. Is that the same process as charcoal?
Well, there's different ways you can get black soil. So a lot of areas that have a lot of marshland, it is really dark because it is decaying organic matter. And there's a lot of plants can put up with that. Not, these plants could put up with that kind of black soil. These plants can't. But a lot of the plants, grasses and reeds, if you have a lot of grassland, it makes the soil right underneath it fairly dark because there's so much grass piled up over time, and it decomposes into this layer that's, it's got plenty of nutrition because all this dead grass, and it is black because of the sewer gases that are building up in it. But a lot of plants will grow in that. This side, corn, wheat, they're used to being on grassland.
How about sunflowers?
It would be over here with the daisies. So a lot of plants can tolerate that kind of soil, but a lot of plants can't. And most plants will do better if they don't have that type of soil. So anyway, so that's proper black soil is charcoal based. Okay, so sandy loam is one of the better natural soils, but we know that if you up the oxygen, plants grow more vigorously. So hydroponics, the most expensive farming and growing of plants in the world is hydroponics. It's inside an enclosed structure that's heated. So the plants have to grow fast in there for them to make a profit. So on hydroponics, they use things that are very airy for the roots. Perlite, pumice, clay pellets. This is interesting because clay doesn't breathe, but if you fire the big pellets like this, it breathes really good. It's like this is the ideal soil. It's clay, but it's fired clay, so there's big gaps between them. So this is the most expensive soil in the world, and they use it for the most expensive crops in the world, which are marijuana crops, because they'll grow faster in here than they will in actual dirt. So unfortunately, what happened was that the nursery industry asked the researchers at the universities how to grow plants in a container the fastest. Unfortunately, it wasn't this. That what my dad used for 20 years, the first 20 years when he was doing business, was this. And I remember as a kid, we never had heard, in those days, we'd never heard of root rot. The biggest problem in the trade, root bound. So you'd pull out a plant out of the one of the pots my dad has, there'd be white roots circling and circling and circling after a year or so. So everybody's complaining, oh, your plants are root bound, but we never heard the term root rot because it never happened. This soil, there's no way it'll happen. But the nurseries asked the researchers how to make plants grow the fastest. It turns out this grows plants faster. Bark, a mulch made out of bark will grow plants the faster. And one of the problems we have in history is that, so when I was a kid, in those days, nurseries were grower retailers, and we still are. We grow the plants, we sell. So we hear the feedback. Nowadays, most nurseries are separated. You got the growers and you got the retailers. So the growers don't see their plants after 3 months. It takes them 3 months usually to grow a crop. The retailers get all the feedback, but it doesn't transfer. So what happens? So it only takes 3 months to grow a plant. So let's go, we'll go months here. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And we'll go permeability. Let's go porosity with blue. Porosity is the ability to hold water. And permeability is the ability to breathe. So let's go first. So for a soil like this that never changes, the porosity will hold steady. And the permeability will also hold steady. But for this product, the initial porosity is really low, but it's still enough to hold, when we first put a plant in a pot, it's a small plant, so it doesn't need that much water. So the porosity is low, but as this stuff decays, the porosity starts going higher and higher. So it goes like this. And the permeability, super high when it's fresh like this, super high. So the plants really grow fast. The roots have a lot of oxygen. Permeability does this. So at 3 months, the plants are still looking pretty good. But what the research paper says, at 8 months, you've got to either put them in fresh dirt, your fresh bark, or you have to throw the plant away, or you have to have it sold before you reach 8 months, because that's when it becomes toxic. So that's what the research says. So I contacted the professor. This was like 20 years ago when I was still hoping that they would have some sense in their brains. And I said, well, this doesn't make any sense for us. I'm a nursery in Southern California. We keep the plants for a long time, and they couldn't make any real excuse. They said, well, this is what we were asked to find out. And it's what works for most wholesale growers. So in the wholesale trade, so Southern California, Southern Florida are two unique places in the United States. We can keep the same plant in the same pot in our nursery outdoors year round. Any place else in the United States, you leave them in the container and they freeze to death by November. You get freezing weather. Texas gets freezing weather, so they can't have plants in containers. So most nurseries across the United States buy their plants in April, and they sell them. They have a fire sale when fall starts and get rid of all of them before they rot away and die. So they never see them going downhill. They have a shorter season than we do. We see them turning ugly because we keep them around. Now, we know how to fix them. Most nurseries, they have a hospital area where they'll sell you them cheaper as they die. Or as, some plants don't die from this. They just get really, like the strawberry plant doesn't die from this. It just gets really ugly. And if you surround them with really good soil or real dirt, they often come back in time. They make it back. But that's the problem we have. So everybody's making soils that have a lifespan. We went to a meeting at UCLA probably around 2000, and they were talking about this. They said most potting soils in the United States, well, pretty much all potting soils in the United States, are meant to last 5 months. Because most places in the United States, they plant things in the spring and everything dies in the fall. So that's their goal, is to make potting soil the last 5 months. Well, when we figured this out in 1993, we stopped selling the potting soils we were selling because we said, this is not what we want. We don't want plants to die after 5 months. We want stuff that's going to be good for years in a pot. So that's when we started making our own potting soil. We just couldn't understand why the rest of the companies, well, that's why, because in most other places, they don't keep their plants past fall. You need 5 months of good usage of their potting soils. And a lot of plants, they don't even like, even initially they don't do too well because this stuff, some of the problems we have with fresh wood and bark, a lot of tannins in them. And the tannins make plants turn colors. So you get these funny colored leaves. Even if the plant's healthy, it's funny colored because of the tannins in the wood and bark. So among organic materials, so charcoal, you can use charcoal as soil because it doesn't break down. It always is coarse material, so it'll always breathe. Charcoal does hold water. Just so you know, rice hulls just about don't decompose. So what we learned about rice hulls is they're 90% silica, which is a mineral, it's not organic matter that breaks down. So rice hulls do not actually break down either. Peat moss does break down, but it has some qualities that we really like. So we'll talk about that a little later. Redwood mulch is very slow to break down. That's redwood compost in there. It'll last 7 years, so it's not as bad as other things. Although you can make this bad if you're not careful. Coconut coir breaks down about as fast as peat does. So after about a year and a half, if it's pure coconut coir, then the plant starts to suffocate because it can't breathe anymore. So coconut coir is very fibrous, but as it decomposes, it gets real sludgy too. Plus coconut coir is very fresh. So it has a lot of tannins. We noticed that when we started growing things in coconut coir for just to see what happens, they're all orange. And I've been to nurseries that use 100% coconut coir. All their plants are orange when you compare them to our plants. That's a tannin in the coconut coir. Peat moss doesn't have any tannins in it because it's been sitting. So these are dead reeds that have been sitting at the bottom of the lake for a decade or more, 10 decades. So the tannins are gone out of the material. So it's a little more inert for us. And then rare compost doesn't have any, it breaks down way too fast to use the soil. So, but the majority of the big growers, the big name growers, are using some kind of fir bark. So the big names out there use fir bark. Now, what's interesting is back in the 90s, I got a research journal from the Netherlands where they do a lot there. Netherlands, their whole economy is based on what they can grow in greenhouses. And so they did a lot of research on material to use in containers. And now the Netherlands also invented the transport system of pallets and forklifts. So forklifting and wood pallets was their invention. And it is, we have a forklift that has a Dutch name on it, and we use a lot of wood pallets. So they had a lot of wood pallets that after they got old, they wanted to see if they can make something to grow plants in it. Just like the United States was doing with wood products back in the 80s. So they spent years trying to make wood into a growing medium for their hothouse plants. And they said, doesn't work. They said the problem with wood and bark is that it's not a uniform material. So parts of this block of wood will decompose way faster than other parts. And same with bark. It's not a uniform material. So when they grind it down and make a medium out of it, they can't tell the farmer how long it will last because they don't know. Different parts of wood and bark break down at different rates. So they stay away from wood and bark as a soil medium to grow their crops. Yet all of the United States uses wood and bark to grow their plants. They said the only safe things are sand, perlite, so pumice rock is quartz. Perlite is also quartz. This has air holes in it due to to gases underground. And this is popped quartz done in an oven. So they're basically the same material. Lots of air holes in them, but quartz. Vermiculite is popped clay. So we don't use it that much because it gets real slimy after a while because it's just popped clay. But if you want to have your soil hold water better, you add just a tiny bit of vermiculite. Don't add too much. It gums up things real fast. And then clay pellets was the latest invention. Now they also use plastic foam and fiberglass, blocks of fiberglass, which is, it's again quartz. So that's what they recommend for best plant growth. They don't touch any of these things that nurseries in the United States use, because because they were asked the wrong question. You know, how do you grow a plant the fastest? Well, and it's also cheap, but then it's also deadly for a lot of things. Yes.
You know, a pallet is a wood product, right?
Pardon?
A pallet. So the question I had when I go to Home Depot is wood products are in the compost that they're selling because they grind up pallets.
Right.
But when they grind up the pallets, they don't say where the pallets come from. So the whatever chemical company, they have chemicals
Right.
in wood. They just grind it up, because I've been doing compost lately from Home Depot, one bag, and I found nails in it. So obviously it came from pallets. I mean, it's got big nails and stuff.
Yeah.
They don't take the nails out. I don't know why.
I use
Well, yeah, it would have zinc. It would have zinc and iron.
They
didn't show you that.
No.
Okay, so one other thing to talk about. So soil, whether it be, now what's interesting is clay soil used to be called rich soil. And this stuff used to be called the poor soil. And you'll still see that in literature nowadays. They'll tell you that lavender and tarragon needs poor soil. They don't like the rich soil because they rot in it. So, 150 years ago, so I have a book, someone lent me a book that was written in 1900, University of California, was around back then, and they're talking about farming in Orange County. They said the farmers in Orange County were in the rich clay soil Fountain Valley, Westminster. They needed that clay soil because this soil in the middle of Irvine and Anaheim was too dry after the rains were done to farm in. So clay soil was originally called the rich soil, and this soil is called the poor soil. Now anyone who has a yard full of this can grow anything. In a yard full of clay, everything's rotting. So the reason clay rots plants is it doesn't do it naturally. It's a problem with the plants that were being sold. So the plants that were being sold are in this compost, and you put that in a hole in the ground. It's using up, and you keep it moist, the compost in here is still using up the oxygen. And when the oxygen level around the roots gets too low, that's what causes root rot. Now, if you're surrounded by sand, there's enough airflow that this will probably not have a problem, probably not rot out. But if you put it in clay, so it's in a little hole in clay and it's got organic matter around the roots, it's very easy to rot it because it's decomposing in this little hole that can't breathe, the oxygen can't get to it, and that's what causes the root rot. Now, I was emailing with a professor at UC Berkeley that was trying to figure out why all the native plantings along California highways just die. So everyone was noticing they put native plants along the highways and they would just die. And what his conclusion was, the plants we get from the growers already have root rot when we get them. And I emailed and I said, yeah, they shouldn't be growing plants in recycled plant material. He says, I concur. They should be going in pure sand. But all the growers were told by the universities to grow them in rotting plant material. So that's where we're stuck right now. So we know what happens when you have them in rotting plant material. They're very susceptible to root rot. So most farms, there's no such thing as overwatering because they're in soil like this. So I don't know if you remember 2 years ago when we had all that rain, or was it 3 years ago? 2 years ago. Or 3 rainy seasons ago, we had all that rain, all that snowpack in the Sierras. And so the groundwater in the Central Valley has been getting really low because they've been pumping water out of the ground and everything's sinking. So when they saw that snowpack up there, the water just told the farmers, you turn on your sprinklers, you don't turn them off, just flood your fields. And this was fields with trees and grapevines and everything in them. They just told them flood them. It doesn't hurt the plants. You flood the field because they're in real dirt. So they just left them underwater all winter long so they can replenish that groundwater because they had plenty of water that year, 2 years ago. So, but there are farmlands that they can't do that on. So they said right around the Delta region, marshland, it's reclaimed marshland there. They said that soil is 40% organic and they can't grow anything permanent in it. And the crops they do grow in it, they have to manage their watering very carefully because it is all these dead reeds that make up most of the soil. So they have to manage their watering very carefully. So now, one of the things to know is that if you grow plants in a container, so like when I was a kid, this stuff worked in pots pretty good because it's very sandy. But my dad mostly grew 5-gallon plants. We didn't grow many plants in containers this small. Even the 1-gallon containers we had those days were much taller than this. This is not, this, still call it 1 gallon, but it's not even close anymore. You know how big a 1-gallon jug is. So in the old days, we had taller 1-gallon pots. So this drains really well in a taller container. Like the 5-gallon containers were a foot tall. The problem with soil or any growing medium is if it's in a non-porous container, and we had metal containers in those days, the soil won't drain all the way out. There is what is called a perched water table. So in the ground, the soil essentially is a series of sponges, one on top of the other. So the water just keeps getting pulled down into the next sponge. But in container, there's no sponge underneath it. So like this last sponge here, the coarseness of the material will determine how high the water. So this is a perched water table, which means it's saturated so that there's no air spaces. There are air spaces here and there's still moisture up here, but down here there's no more air spaces. So that is saturated at the bottom of the sponge. And the type of soil that's in the pot will determine the height of that. So if the material is real fine like this, the perched water table is pretty substantial. If it's coarser like this sand, it'll be lower. And the perched water table can be a problem if it's there long enough. So if you have, we notice if you fill a pot with clay soil, the perched water table is all the way at the top. And if you put a plant in that, the roots stay right on the surface. They don't rot, they just grow right on the surface because they can't breathe going down into that saturated clay soil, because eventually the roots are using up the oxygen in the water. If the water's not moving anywhere, the oxygen level of the water drops too low. So plants in clay soil tend to stay near the surface, even if the clay is real wet, because they can't breathe in clay anyway. And it's hard for the water in that clay to be replenished, or the oxygen in the water to be replenished. So you have to make the soil in a pot coarser. So pure sand is actually coarse enough to do a good job, but it's heavy. If you have a 5-gallon, in those days it was a true 5 gallons of sand, that would have been 40, 50 pounds of sand. I mean, that's what dirt actually weighs. Real dirt is about the same weight as sand. So sand is considered light soil. So when we made our own potting soil back in the early 90s, we go, okay, we don't want to use sand. What's the lightest version of sand that's coarse? that's natural, and it turns out it's pumice rock. So we grew plants in pumice, and they grew really fast, but they do kind of dry out kind of fast because this doesn't hold as much moisture as sand does. Sand actually is perfect potting soil. If you go back into the old literature, the original citrus trees grown in big clay pots in France in the 1870s, they said they analyzed the soil in 1920. Out of those big pots, it was 98% sand. They just grew those citrus trees in pure sand. My dad's bonsai books, and bonsai has been practiced for thousands of years. They said that the most vigorous growing medium in a pot is sand. So people knew before the universities got involved what real dirt, what good potting soil was, but it is heavy. So pumice weighs about 40% as much as sand does. So it's a lot lighter than sand. There's a lot of different pumices. The pumice we're using is about 40% as heavy as sand, but I've had pumice from people, soil researchers, that was so light you can put in your hand and blow and it just floats. So there are real light pumices out there. But we needed this to hold a little more moisture. Now clay holds water really well, but clay doesn't give up water to plants very well. So we were told by some of the guys, professors at University of Riverside, that peat moss is the best medium, natural medium to hold water, because peat moss will let the plant have all the water off the peat moss. So you'll notice that if you have a plant, there are some companies that grow plants in pure peat. They're wet, and then they're bone dry, because the plant will take all the water off the peat and suddenly it's bone dry. So it wilts all of a sudden, but that's peat moss. So what we tried is we put these two together to see what we would get. Stuff that holds water the best, stuff that holds air the best. And we got our acid mix potting soil, which I'm out of at the moment, but we've made it ever since because everything grows really well in it for years and years and years. So that's always worked, but peat moss does decompose, not to the point where it suffocates roots because there's so much air there, but it loses volume. So we made another soil that we call top pot that doesn't seem to shrink. Now our top pot is 35% peat, 30% pumice, 20% perlite, which again is the man-made pumice. Now sometimes perlite is heavier than pumice, sometimes usually perlite's lighter than pumice. 10% sand. We wanted to get some kind of sand in there, and the people who make these bags for us says, that's all we'll let you put in is 10%. I'd rather put in more than that, but they said that type of bag can't hold the weight. You have to go to that much thicker material that they put sand in, which is a way more expensive bag. And then 5% charcoal. We wanted the charcoal in there since it actually can help. And we noticed that at this mix, which is 60% quartz, 65% inert material, the soil doesn't shrink, even though it's 35% peat. And we think what's going on is that the gaps between the particles are so big. At 35% peat, the peat is just not contributing to the volume. It's in between the bigger particles. So it does, even though the peat is disappearing on us over time, we don't seem to get the soil shrinking on us. So this plant has been in our top pot for 2 years, and it doesn't seem to have shrunk. If we get plants from other growers, within a year they're like this. They've lost about 30-40% because that's how much organic material minimum they're using. But our soil doesn't seem to shrink at all. Plus, our trees don't lean. So you get trees from any other grower that's using organic matter, and they all do, they have their trees staked up because they started leaning as the wood started decomposing. The plant started to collapse down. So they have to restake them, make them straight again. And even then, a lot of times the stakes are not straight because everything in that soil is collapsing on them. So,
If we're using that, you said they limit the sand, could we add more sand in our sand?
oh yes. Well, you can
How much more would you add?
make it 100% sand.
I mean, if you're gonna use mix the top part.
You can make it 100%. So anywhere from 100% top pot, 100% sand. Because when we did all our testing in 93, 94, sand had made the prettiest plants.
And is that outdoor or both outdoor?
That was outdoors. But sand made the prettiest plants. I mean, we'd have, well, okay, the first plant we did was a strawberry plant. So we put a strawberry plant like this in a pot this big, and we had it was like a 10-inch pot. No, it wasn't bigger than that. It was about a 12-inch pot, and a strawberry plant in pure sand. So we were using the organic potting soil at the time. So when the organic potting soil, it stayed about this big. In pure sand, that strawberry plant was 30 inches across with leaflets that big. We're going, God, there's no way we can continue selling this potting soil that we're selling, because in sand it was incredible. I mean, we had always wondered why they said to space strawberry plants on farms 8 inches apart, because they'd always been like 8 inches wide.
Yeah.
And then we put them in sand, and suddenly they're 30 inches across. We're going, okay. So at that point, we said, no way, we can't sell the organic potting soils anymore. They just they're worse. They're negative value. Totally negative value. But we knew we couldn't sell sand, but we know sand works because we had perfect plants. I mean, not a single yellow leaf, not a single brown edge. You had to fertilize them, but you still have to fertilize organic matter because it has very little, the wood and bark have very little nutrition. The nutrition's in leaves, it's not in wood or bark. So, yes.
I was wondering, I would always, when you transplanted something that we, especially when we got like young trees,
Mm-hmm.
we were always told that, oh God, I forgot what I was gonna say now.
Transplanting.
Oh, yes, we were taught that when we transplanted it, we needed to spread the roots out. Does that matter?
That's next week's topic, but it can matter. So briefly, I'll just say that if you expect that tree to stand up and not fall over, and if it's if it's a 100-foot eucalyptus tree, you do not want that thing falling over from the wind. So you make sure its roots are nice and straight, because eucalyptus do not straighten the roots by themselves. If they're wound up in a pot, they never straighten out. So it's like a big spring in the ground, and the wind comes over, knocks it over, kills somebody, destroys some cars or houses. So that's bad. So any type of tree that you expect to grow 100-foot tall, it's nice to straighten roots out. Now, eucalyptus are notably the worst because they don't seem to grow roots from the trunk, whereas most plants will send off totally new roots straight from the trunk, and so they don't have that problem like eucalyptus do. But eucalyptus, they said, only the tips of the roots grow. So they got that big spring in the ground, so they're doubly bad than most trees. But yeah, so if it's a pine tree you want to grow 100-foot tall, yeah, I would probably want to straighten the roots out. But for a peach tree that grows 8 foot, 10 foot, if it falls over, nobody's going to get hurt or die from that, and it's not a big deal. So for most trees we sell, it's not a big deal. But if it's a tree that's supposed to grow really big and potentially be a problem, then we won't want the roots to be straight.
Didn't the railroads have problems when they, like in the desert, it seemed like they wanted to plant eucalyptus along the tracks to block the wind. And did they have a terrible time with that? I thought I remember hearing something about that.
Well, they planted eucalyptus to make railroad ties,
Oh.
and they didn't work. And they didn't work because eucalyptus would warp too much.
Mm-hmm.
They said the wood and eucalyptus in Australia don't have this problem, but in California they do, because we didn't have the predators that would slow down the growth of the eucalyptus. So they said if you're in Australia, there's so many animals eating the young trees that they only grow a foot a year or so there. Here they grow 20 foot a year because there weren't, now there are some more predators on them, but there weren't any predators eating up the trees, so they were growing too fast and the wood was warping, so couldn't make railroad ties out of them. That's what I understand anyway.
Oh, I
So.
think I remember you saying something about that.
Okay, so we made a soil that's different than dirt for pots. Any questions? So next week we'll go over, yes. Oh.
So say you're working with clay soil and you want to put a plant in, do you want to replace that soil with sand, or is there a way you can mix that clay in?
Well, you can make clay breathe better by mixing a lot of sand with it, but usually you're creating too much volume that way. So in other words, if you want to make the clay breathe a foot deep, you've probably got to add a foot of sand to it to make it breathe. So your soil becomes a lot higher. Now, again, clay without compost, there's no problems with it. In the old days, it was the best farm soil. But because all the plants are being grown in compost, you put them in clay, you can lose them. So you got to fix the plant. If you fix the plant rather than the soil, you can do it. Well, you can do it either way. So a friend of mine who used to be a contractor in San Juan Capistrano, where it's really clayish in that area, he would just surround each plant with sand. When they planted a plant in the clay, they would surround it with sand so that plenty of air can get to it. In fact, that is the method of choice for all the big plantings. So mall plantings, hotel plantings, when they bring in these big box trees, they're growing in compost. Some box tree growers don't bother because they're such big boxes, the compost doesn't really lighten the soil at all. So they just use real dirt in the boxes. But they do surround the root balls with just sand. So all the big malls and all the big projects, we see that on the spec sheets, surround this plant with sand. You backfill with sand.
Okay, so say you've done that, you've got clay soil surrounded, you want to mix in a bunch of peat and charcoal and
No, you don't need that. And that's mainly for containers to hold moisture. If your ground is clay, the clay itself holds a lot of moisture.
Yeah, so for compaction, I guess your best recourse is a lot of mulch on top.
Right. So nature knows how to decompact soil with. Okay, I should mention that. Thank you. So nature has a way of making soil breathe better. So say you've got a clayish type soil here. When you have a pile of dead leaves on top and other dead things, there'll be some stems on there too and some animal manure. When plant material decomposes, so plant material is mostly cellulose strands. So cellulose is a rearranged sugar molecule. So wood is pretty much a piece of sugar that we can't eat because it's been rearranged into a different shape. And so it's strands of cellulose, which are sugar molecules, and they're glued together with another type of sugar molecule that's been rearranged, and it's called lignin. So lignin is holding all the cellulose strands together in the shape of wood. As the leaves and things decompose, the lignin is released into the dirt. And lignin is really powerful glue. And what happens is that the soil and the clay particles that were just loose in the ground the lignin tends to glue them in together into bigger pieces. So they call that granulation. Another term is aggregation. I think there's a third term, but they all mean the same thing. The small clay particles are being glued together into bigger chunks. So it's starting now to act like sand. And then so in nature, the roots of the plants, so 90% of all plants have a fungus attached to them called a mycorrhizal fungus. Uh-oh. It's either attached or it's really closely associated with the roots, and they go up into the dead stuff up here and decompose it. And the minerals from this that the plant wants, they just put right back into the roots of the plant next to them. So they're doing the decomposition. These mycorrhizal fungi roots are so heavily structured in the soil that they said they're like girders, steel girders in the ground. They're arranging the soil particles, and then the microscopic worms, nematodes, which are microscopic worms. There's mostly good nematodes, some bad nematodes. They punch the holes through this whole thing to make it like Swiss cheese. So you have the little tiny worms, the mycorrhizal fungus, the lignin, all combining to make a very airy structure in the ground. Earthworms aren't part of that. There are no earthworms native to North America or to the US. So all the earthworms that we have nowadays are either from Europe or China. They said that in most areas of the United States, earthworms were eliminated during the last ice age. The ice sheets just scraped off all the worms. I guess they pushed them down to Mexico. But so there's no earthworms native here. So they don't want you to put earthworms around because they're either European or Chinese. We heard there's some valley in Oregon where there's still some native earthworms there. And there may be some isolated valleys where the glaciers didn't wipe out the earthworms. But they said in general in the United States there aren't any native earthworms and everything is foreign. And earthworms do as much bad as they do good, or more bad than good. So they no longer recommend them for use in the garden to aerate the soil because they eat plants. I mean, I was amazed when I was in high school, my dad's nursery, I was watching the earthworm at night. It was dragging a leaf into its hole. I'm going, I didn't know earthworms cut off leaves and dragged them underground. I thought they were all good because we were taught that.
I can't turn a spade without thinking enough.
Pardon?
I can hardly turn a spade anywhere it's moist enough.
Yeah, a lot of foreign invaders.
Start feeding the chickens? Is that what you're
Well, you can't get rid of them once you have them.
Yeah.
But they did note that in the Midwest, some of the native ecosystems are dying, and they are attributing it to the invasion of earthworms from Europe. So they make the ecosystem more adaptable to European plants, which we grow a lot of anyway. And Asian plants are more adapted to earthworms in the root system than the native plants, they said. So, interesting. Anyway, that's how nature makes better soil. So if you have clay soil, you just make sure there's always a lot of organic matter on the surface, and all these things will happen if you leave it alone and don't use too many chemical fertilizers. So mycorrhizal fungus does not like soluble chemical fertilizers very much, particularly phosphorus. So
All the organic matter, probably.
What about the one we use for, I forgot the name of it, the little pellets you recommend for the
Osmocote.
Osmocote.
Yeah, we use that. And that's mainly for container use because it takes a while for nature to set up shop in a container. So it
You
does.
shouldn't need that with this, right?
Right. We don't need the osmocote fertilizer in natural system. So the mycorrhizal fungus, we sell the fungus, but you don't need to buy it for things in the ground. So the mycorrhizal fungus, the spores float in the air. It's pretty much universal. Even Consumer Reports 25 years ago said that buying this is like buying snake oil. However, in a container setup, if you're using our soils, it's not there. So you have to add it.
Regular soil to it, will that do it?
Hmm?
Just adding some soil to it, will that do it?
It may. It certainly may. Just adding dirt from the ground to it. I talked to a professor at UC Riverside that went up to Mount St. Helens. They want to see how, after Mount St. Helens blew, which was a couple hundred square mile area, they want to see how fast the mycorrhizal repopulated that whole area. They said 5 years, the entire area was repopulated again with the mycorrhizal fungus so that the trees can grow back. They couldn't grow on the native, on the volcanic rock, but with the mycorrhizal fungus there, then the mycorrhizal fungus can actually eat rocks, and it can recycle the dead leaves that are on the rocks, and then the trees can start growing again. So, any other questions today? So next week we'll go over what plants are most sensitive to this compost, and how to fix them, and how to put them in the ground, and other options for putting them in the ground so they don't die with all this compost around the roots. Yes.
On these fertilizers that you have, I noticed that tree fertilizer that you have, that you sell, is in the perfect ratio for plants. Can you put that with your vegetables in your garden?
Yeah, pretty much. The ag department about 10 years ago sent us letters saying that the ratio between nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium for the average crop in the United States was 6:4.
6:4. Or 3:1:2.
Right.
So that could be used in the garden?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Good idea.
The problem, we'll go over that 2 weeks from now. We'll talk about fertilizers, because there is issues with fertilizers, because when you put these on the ground, some of them stick around and some don't.
And
So it's
have
like,
to incorporate them in the ground and turn them over.
no, you just put them on top. So in nature, everything falls on top of the ground. It doesn't get buried. You bury them in the ground, you start creating sewer gases wherever you bury them.
Oh, yeah.
So,
What about like with seed starting? Is this good for like, your little trays of starting your seeds and things like that?
yeah, there's a lot of ways you can start seed. A friend of mine whose job was to start seedlings for farmers, they had this really pure sand that they use, and whenever they used it, they had to re-sterilize it for the next batch of seeds. So they had this big steam oven in there, and they would sterilize their sand for the use with the next plant. So that's the main thing is, not all seeds are sensitive. I mean, if you have a big pumpkin seed, you can grow that on anything. But we like to use, so most of the seed starting mixes that are sold are a mixture of peat and perlite.
Right.
So if you get a bag of peat and a bag of perlite and you mix them together, and I'll do that for some of the smaller seeds. For some of the coarser seeds, I'll use our mix, which is pumice and peat moss. This is still considered sterile, and these two are considered sterile. Our top pot has got unsterilized sand, so there's a slight chance you'll get a damp off disease along with the top pot that might hurt a seedling. But again, I would say corn, squash, pumpkin seeds, no big deal. The seeds are huge, so they're real strong. They won't die from that.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Hope I didn't miss anything. Okay. So one thing, I brought this up because this is one thing you can add to your soil that's very similar to charcoal. So charcoal, and this is humic acids are dug out of the ground in Texas, it's a coal deposit. So it's similar. It's essentially the same as charcoal. Charcoal's fresh, and a coal deposit's been in the ground for what they claim is 80 million. Was it 80 million? 36 million years? I mean, the coal deposit that's in Western Europe, Eastern United States, down to Texas is all the same coal deposit. That is one of the weirdest things. I was listening once to this professor who studied the coal deposits around the world. He says the English coal and the Virginia coal are exactly the same thing. They're formed at the same time, all the way down to Texas. And he says it's all bark. They haven't found anything in the coal deposit but bark, which is another real big mystery. No wood in it. It's all bark from trees from 36 million years ago or whatnot.
Could be dinosaur bones.
36 million year event.
But something happened
Yeah.
that created. Now they said that what's happening in Spirit Lake next to Mount St. Helens may be exactly what happened. So they said when Mount St. Helens blew and Spirit Lake formed, all these trees were pushed into the lake. And they said to this date, the trunks are still there in the lake, but all the bark's been rubbed off. So all the bark's at the bottom of the lake and the wood's floating on the surface still. So they think there was some huge event back then that made all the trees float and created this huge deposit of bark from Europe. Well, apparently they were just one piece of land back then, all the way down to Texas. That's what their theory right now is how that formed. That's really wild. Something to think about. But okay, any other questions today?